He said it with a quiet smile, the kind that sneaks up from somewhere deep in your chest, where meaning lives. Across the table, his younger brother Jake smiled too. "That's great, man." But something was missing. Jake's eyes never lingered, and that was the moment David felt it, an unspoken distance that cut deeper than words, a compliment without curiosity, a nod without presence. It wasn't about what Jake said, it was about everything he didn't do. He didn't ask, "What's that been like for you?" Didn't lean in, didn't pause, just glanced at his phone, and then changed the subject, like flipping the channel during the best part of the movie. And that's when the ache set in, because maybe Jake had always been like that, distant, not because he didn't care, but because he never quite knew how. He'd grown up in a house where emotions weren't welcomed, just managed. Vulnerability was never modeled. Only strength, only silence. So when moments called for tenderness, he reached for distraction instead. He'd always been the one to keep things light, deflect with humor, skim the surface and call it closeness. But that night, David cracked open something real, and Jake didn't reach for it. David didn't just feel ignored, he felt invisible, like his joy had no room to exist in that space. Later that night, he sat across from me. Hands folded, voice low, shoulders slumped, and then he said it again, softer this time. It was like the compliment bruised me, not because Jake said something cruel, but because he didn't mean what he said. Because in that moment, David wasn't looking for praise, he was reaching for connection. He had finally opened a door that had been shut for years, and his brother didn't even try to walk through it. That's what stung. He didn't want applause. He just wanted to be seen, to be felt, to be known by someone who shared his blood. But instead, it landed flat. And the silence that followed it wasn't just absence. It was confirmation, because sometimes that's how it starts. Not with betrayal, not with yelling, not with slammed doors. It starts in the energy, a flicker in the air, a tension you can't name, but your soul recognizes instantly. This is where Jung's idea of the shadow comes in, the part of us we often don't see, but that quietly controls how we show up in the world, especially in our relationships. This invisible shift, this flicker in the air, is what Jung called the shadow. It's the part of ourselves we hide, and in this case, it's what kept Jake from fully embracing the connection David was reaching for. Carl Jung had a word for it, the shadow. It's not the person, it's the unspoken part inside them, the resentment they don't talk about, the envy they pretend isn't there, the fear they haven't faced, the tenderness they never learned how to show. Jake's reluctance to engage wasn't cruelty, it was his shadow, the part of himself he had never confronted. His fear of vulnerability, his discomfort with intimacy, his belief that love had to be distant to be safe, that hidden part shaped how he responded to David, not because he didn't love him, but because his unexamined pain made him incapable of stepping closer, the unacknowledged part of him that resisted connection. Out of fear, it might demand more than he knew how to give. Not all shadows hide in quiet corners, some wear grins, and it doesn't always show up as silence. Sometimes it shows up as laughter, a joke, a jab, wrapped in a smile that looks harmless, until it isn't, because deep down, your gut knows that wasn't humor, that was hurt, disguised. Once you notice the pattern, you can't unsee it. It speaks louder every time, in the way they talk, in what they call just teasing. "You're so sensitive. Relax. I'm just messing with you." You've heard it more times than you can count. It sounds casual, playful even, but it doesn't land that way. Not anymore, because deep down, you know the difference between a joke and a jab. They bring up your past. That time, you failed. That one thing you regret. They poke at your weight, your marriage, your job, your age, and they wrap it all in a laugh. Everyone else joins in. You do too, because what else can you do? Call it out and you're too serious. Can't take a joke. Always looking for a problem, so you stay quiet. But later that night, it hits you like a whisper from your gut. That wasn't funny. That was a wound in disguise. You start to notice the pattern, and once you see it for what it is, you can't unsee it. That's when it begins to speak louder. In the way they talk, in what they call just teasing. You're so sensitive. Relax. I'm just messing. With you, you've heard it, more times than you can count. It sounds casual, playful even, but it doesn't land that way. Not anymore. Because deep down, you know the difference between a joke and a jab. They bring up your past. That time you failed, that one thing you regret. They poke at your weight, your marriage, your job, your age. And they wrap it all in a laugh. Everyone else joins in, you do too. Because what else can you do? Call it out. And you're too serious. Can't take a joke. Always looking for a problem, so you stay quiet, but later that night, it hits you like a whisper from your gut. That wasn't funny. That was a wound in disguise. Carl Jung once said, everything that irritates us about others can lead us to an understanding of ourselves. But most people, they don't want understanding. They want relief. So they dump their bitterness onto you, dress it up as humor, and I call it love. It's not love, it's projection. And in my book, that kind of sarcasm isn't harmless. It's the most polite form of cruelty there is, especially when it comes from someone who claims to care. And just when you start to see through the jokes, another pattern begins to show up, one that doesn't mock you to your face, but quietly chips away at your momentum. It doesn't sound like sarcasm. It sounds like, oops, they forget to tell you about the meeting, the opportunity, the dinner you should have been at. They say, oh man, I thought I told you, or it must have slipped my mind, but it always slips when it matters most. They give you advice, but it's the kind that leads you in circles, leaves you doubting yourself, second-guessing your instincts. And they do it with a warm tone, like they're doing you a favor. They call it protection.wisdom, just looking out, but every time they help, you lose ground. Your confidence dips, your momentum fades, and here's the real truth. It's not their memory that's unreliable. It's their ability to handle your growth. Carl Jung said it clearly. When a man feels inferior, he may not rise, he may pull others down. That's what this is. They see you climbing and something inside them starts to ache. So they keep you small, not cruelly, just enough to hold you close. If someone is always near when you're low, but conveniently, distant when you shine. If they encourage doubt, but never your dreams, then let's call it what it is. You're not being supported. You're being managed. By taking your life back, you reclaim not only your strength, but your peace and the respect you deserve from those who truly care, and it's time to take your life back from the hands that are pretending to hold it steady. But sometimes it's not what they forget to share. It's what they can't seem to let you have. Not the opportunity itself, but the moment that should have been yours. You say, I finally got promoted. They nod. Pause, then say, yeah, I just bought a brand new truck. You're not trying to compete. You're just sharing your moment. But suddenly, it's not your moment anymore. The light shifts, the attention moves, and the air gets heavier. It's subtle, not loud, not rude, just enough to remind you that your joy makes them uncomfortable, because your progress shines a light on the places they've stayed stuck. You talk about success. They change the subject. You celebrate. A win. They pivot to themselves. They're not clapping, they're calculating. You didn't enter a contest, but they did. To them, your joy isn't a gift to witness. It's a scoreboard they can't ignore, and when someone always needs to one-up, you match you or subtly steer the spotlight away from you. You're not in a friendship, you're in quiet competition, and over time, that quiet drains you, even when you're ahead, because in that game, nobody really wins. Eventually, you stop trying to win, you stop trying to compete, you just hope for someone who'll sit beside you and mean it. But even that sometimes feels hollow. They show up, but only as a body in the room. They say all the right things, proud of you. Wow, man, that's big. But it's like listening to an actor read lines. No warmth, no spark in their eyes. They respond out of obligation, not connection. Their voice is hollow, their presence polite but distant. They ask no questions. They don't dive deeper. They don't stick around in your joy. Just a nod, a smile. Then a retreat. That's not presence, that's performance. Real support is curious. It celebrates in detail. It hangs around. Fake support. It drops by, nods twice, and vanishes before the moment has a chance to settle. You start to notice it. That emptiness behind their encouragement. And you wonder, is it me? It's not. It's your gut finally telling the truth. They're not walking with you. They're walking near you. And sometimes that's the loneliest place to be. Then there are those who never disappear, but instead quietly reshape your world under the name of care. Their words feel warm, but their tone carries a leash. I wouldn't do that if I were you. They say it softly, with a look of concern, like they're protecting you. But what you feel doesn't match the words. It lands like a leash. You bring up an idea, something that excites you, and suddenly their face tightens. They say it's risky, or impulsive, or a little out of character. You speak from the gut. They call it emotional. You follow your instinct. They call it reckless. And little by little, without even realizing it, you start questioning your own compass. Not because you're wrong, but because it doesn't match their map. Carl Jung once said, "Those who can't master their chaos will try to master you." And that's what this is. They're not helping you think clearly. They're teaching you to shrink. They want you still, manageable, predictable. They call it love, but it's control dressed up in concern, because the truth is, they're not afraid. You'll get hurt. They're afraid you'll succeed without needing them, and that is a kind of fear they don't know how to hide. Some won't try to control your choices. They'll try to control your story instead, not with confrontation, but with quiet conversations you're never invited to. You walk into the room, and something shifts. Laughter quiets, eyes dart. A silence you weren't supposed to notice settles over everything, but you do notice. You weren't part of the conversation, but somehow you were its center, and you know that feeling. It's not paranoia. It's pattern recognition. They won't say it to your face. That would require honesty. That would require courage. So instead, they build stories behind your back. Not because those stories are true, but because they're easy to control. They shape your image, the way they need to see you, the way they need others to see you. And the most dangerous part, they act like nothing happened, smiling when you arrive, shaking your hand, calling you brother, while still carrying pieces of your reputation in their pocket like souvenirs. Carl Jung said, "We disown what we cannot face in ourselves and cast it on others." So when someone spreads gossip, it's not a reflection of you, it's a projection of their pain. You didn't do anything wrong. You just became the mirror that showed them everything they refused to deal with. And mirrors, they're only dangerous to those who live in denial. And if they're not reshaping your image, they're slowly retreating from your presence. Not loudly, not suddenly, just one check-in less. One question left unasked. They don't ask how you are anymore. Not really. They don't lean in. They don't check in. They don't light up when you speak. They still show up. Holidays, birthdays, the occasional text. But the connection. You can feel it like hugging someone through glass. They're physically present but emotionally miles away. Something inside them has shifted, pulled back, gone quiet. Not because you did anything wrong, but because your growth became too loud for their silence. Your wins became reminders of what they didn't do, didn't chase, didn't become. And slowly, being around you started to cost them more than it gave. So now they nod, but don't ask questions. They smile, but it never touches their eyes. They say, "Good for you," but it sounds like, "That should have been me." You're not crazy for noticing. You're not selfish for missing the closeness. You're just hungry for something real. And when you've been starving emotionally, even silence feels heavy because it used to be love. Now it's just absence dressed in familiarity. And sometimes what hurts most isn't what's missing. It's what almost shows up. The delay, the hesitation, the pause that says everything before. The words even arrive. This one slips past most men because it's so small, so quiet. It hides in plain sight. You share something good, a job, a milestone, a new beginning, and for just a second, they freeze, just a flicker. Their face stalls, their eyes flick, their shoulders tighten. Then comes the smile. "That's great, man. Maybe." Even a chuckle or a pat on the back, but you already felt it in the pause, in the delay. That was the shadow. It didn't roar, it didn't glare, it simply hesitated, because applause that waits to show up isn't applause at all. Here's the truth. Words can lie, smiles can mask, but timing tells. If they always need a second to process your success, to catch up emotionally, to put on the celebration like a coat, then that reaction isn't for you, it's for show. And what they're really clapping for is their own ability to hide it. I was still trying to make sense of all this a few years back. One quiet afternoon, I sat across from a woman in Santa Fe, and in just one line, she named the thing I hadn't been able to until then. Years ago, I was sitting in a little outdoor cafe in Santa Fe, late fall, light breeze, the kind of day that makes you think too much. Across from me was a woman named Elise. She was in her early 70s, divorced twice, lived alone by choice, wore silver rings and didn't blink when she spoke. We weren't talking about anything deep, just life, aging, regret, that kind of thing. But she noticed me drifting off. My mind was somewhere else, caught between confusion and memory. She looked at me and said, "You're thinking about someone who smiled, but didn't mean it." I nodded. She leaned in, stirred her tea with this calm grace, and said something I've never forgotten. People's smiles tell you who they want to be seen as, but their silence, that's who they really are. That landed, because by your 50s, or 60s, you've already been there, haven't you? You've seen the pauses, you've felt the tension in the hug, you've watched someone cheer for you with their mouth, but mourn you with their eyes. And now, let's call it what it is. You're not bitter, you're not paranoid, you're just finally paying attention. You're waking up to the truth that's been trying to speak for years, because the older you get, the more allergic you become to fake love, to empty cheers, to hollow eyes that say congrats, but mean why not me? Not everyone deserves a front row seat in your life. Not everyone who calls you brother shows up when it matters. And if someone consistently dims your joy, downplays your wins, or disappears when you rise, let that be the clarity you need. You don't owe your peace to anyone uncomfortable with your progress. By understanding these patterns, you take back your power. And with it, the freedom to grow, connect, and rise. On your own terms, with people who genuinely want to walk beside you, not behind you, because real love celebrates your rise. But shadow love, it only feels safe when you're small. Keep rising anyway, and if this hit you, if it opens something inside, comment below. I won't be the home of anyone else's shadow. Say it out loud. Then live it, because your light was never meant to live in someone else's darkness. And now you finally know that.